Hey everybody, this is GGB. I normally don't do little intros for this one, but I wanted to remind everyone that I did not hit the goal for this week. So anyone, if you put a dare in the comment section below, I have to do it. So just go down there. Anyway, it's time to start the video. Hey everybody, this is GGB, and it's today's episode for College Basketball Update of the Day, Sunday edition. I know everyone's not going to be exactly hyped for the basketball games today. Everyone's going to be watching some football. But I feel like it's mentioning how insane yesterday was. Everyone was probably watching the Bengals game and the Bills game. And I get it. I watched those games too. But honestly, some of these basketball games were so insane. The early morning window, we got 3 of the ranked teams were upset out of the 4. We ended up having Northwestern, which only was 8-6. It was like not even. They were sitting so low in the Big Ten standings. They were tied with Michigan. They were actually doing worse than Michigan. They were tied with Minnesota. They were like the 11 seed. They were not doing great. They were only sitting at 8-6. And you know what they did yesterday? They pulled off a huge, massive upset over Michigan State. So that was the first upset of the day. That would end up being crazy. We ended up having Seton Hall got upset by Marquette, which absolutely threw Seton Hall into a hole in the Big East. Seton Hall, the only 2 teams below it now are St. John's, DePaul, and Georgetown. And St. John's a win from passing Seton Hall. St. John's has played 3 less games than Seton Hall has, and Seton Hall only has 1 more win than them. It's pretty crazy. What's going on in the Big East with Seton Hall? They're not doing great. They're on a 2-game losing streak this week. They're playing poorly. And Marquette exposed that. And is poor. Marquette started out great, and then they had a little bit of some. They've been doing phenomenal now. They started 0-3 in the Big East play. They're 4-3 now, 4th place in the Big East. Pretty crazy upset we had yesterday. And then the other 11 o'clock upset that I didn't even think was a possibility. Like, if you told me, guess order the chances of these teams upsetting the other ones, this one would have been last place. I don't think anyone saw it coming. Did anyone think Kansas State, a team that was completely defeated in Big 12 play, had a legitimate chance against Texas Tech, who would just beat the number 1 team in the country this week? It was crazy, but Kansas State was able to hit their threes, and when they get hot from 3-point range, any team can beat any team. I swear, you watch the highlights for Kansas State, it is just Kansas State shooting threes every time. It's insane. But Kansas State ended up getting hot. They beat Texas Tech. Texas Tech, by the way, falls down to 5th place in the Big 12. So that's not great for them. They sit at 3-2, although technically they're tied for 3rd place with Baylor, with Texas. So it's a 3-way tie for 3rd place. TCU is somehow in 2nd place. I don't know if anyone really saw that coming this year, but TCU was ahead of Baylor, Texas, Texas Tech, Iowa State, Oklahoma, West Virginia. Teams that are legitimately good. And I have not watched TCU play a lot this year, but they ended up coming off a 1-point win over Oklahoma. They're 2-1 in conference, and they probably are a little bit overrated, if you're going to be honest. They only beat Kansas State by 3 points, and they only beat Oklahoma yesterday by 1 point. And these are not top teams in the Big 12, guys. These are bottom feeder Big 12 teams. But to be fair, Kansas State just pulled off a massive upset. TCU's in 2nd place in the Big 12. Don't know how that happened. Then we got not a huge upset, but you're looking at the Southeastern Conference is a little bit shaken up now since Arkansas pulled off such a huge upset over number 12 in LSU. They had lost only 1 game all year, and LSU was top 4. They were 4th place. Unfortunately, this loss, they fall a little bit. Arkansas moves way up the standings. They were bottom 4. Now they're all the way up to 6th place in the in the SEC, which is, I wouldn't say super duper impressive, but they have the same in-conference record as Tennessee and Alabama. That's pretty impressive to me. And then the SEC, in my opinion, is just super confusing. I mean, obviously expected Auburn and Kentucky and LSU to be up there, but for God's sakes, Texas A&M 2nd place in the SEC. We'll see if that stands up. They play Kentucky next week. Mississippi State is up there. Didn't see that coming to start the year. Vanderbilt is actually not sucking at basketball this year, which is pretty crazy to think about. They're ahead of Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, Arkansas, and Ole Miss. Now, Ole Miss isn't obviously as impressive, but I mean, Ole Miss doesn't suck, that's for sure. And then you got the other Big 12 upset. We had some. We'll talk about the other SEC upset. We got Mississippi State to upset Alabama, which is why Mississippi State is fourth place. And they're on a 2-game winning streak. They're 3-1 in conference, and suddenly this is a Mississippi State team that looks like a possible college basketball playoff. I mean, like, Mississippi State looks good. They're coming off a win against Alabama. Alabama's on a slump, 3-game losing streak. Now, to be fair, Mississippi State game was close. They ended up only losing by 2 points. The Auburn game was close, and they ended up losing by 4 points. The Missouri game, looking back on it, is probably their worst loss of the season. Missouri is not a good basketball team this year, and if I had to rank them, the only team that might be worse would be Georgia, probably. But, like, Missouri is not a good basketball team. And, like, the standings show out. Missouri is 1-3 in conference. They're 7-9 overall. They're tied for second to last place in the Big East. I mean, in the SEC. Now, to be fair, that's also with Mississippi, Ole Miss, South Carolina, and Florida. But I don't know who thinks either of those teams are worse than Missouri. Missouri right now is looking just absolutely atrocious. They don't look like a good basketball team right now, and I'm going to be interested to see if they change that. The other Big 12 upset, there's only one more upset to talk about after this one, but in the Big 12, you had Oklahoma State, which were double-digit underdogs, go into Baylor Stadium. So they didn't even get home field advantage. And Oklahoma State, the Cowboys, who don't really have anything to play this year, they were banned from postseason play. They can't be a March Madness team. I don't even know if they can compete in the Big 12 tournament. But yet they still went out there, and they still got a win over the number one team in the country. Well, they're definitely not going to be the number one team in the country anymore. Still in a hugely impressive win for this Oklahoma State squad, and it bumped Baylor down significantly. You're talking about a Baylor team that was tied for first place in the Big 12. With a win, would have been the number one team in the Big 12. Fortunately, now with a loss, they're tied for third. I know, obviously, it's not going to stay that way. Obviously, TCU's a fraudulent team. They're 2-1 records against barely wins over Oklahoma and Kansas State. But still, this is a nutty Big 12 this year. Any team can beat any team, and I think Kansas State and Oklahoma State, the bottom two teams in the country, beating bottom two teams in the Big 12, beating two of the top teams in the Big 12, proved that this week. And then there's one more, one Pac-12 upset, and I just like to give props. Give huge props to Oregon. You're talking about an Oregon team that looked dead in the water to start the season. They were a top 25 team, top 15 team, I believe. And they just looked flat coming out. They did. They looked bad. They turned that thing around like that. They legitimately did. This week, I thought they were going to go 0-2. They went 2-0. They beat the number 3 team in the country in UCLA a couple of days ago. And then a couple of days later, they would beat number 5 USC. Like, it's insane what Oregon has done with their season on a 5-game winning streak now, 4-2 in conference, and suddenly they're tied for third place in the Pac-12. A team that looked just absolutely, I'll say it again, dead in the water. They didn't look like a good basketball team a couple of weeks ago. Suddenly is a team that you're talking about legitimate playoff contender, legitimate team that can win the Pac-12, and I wasn't saying that before this week, and Oregon did. They turned it around, got a big win over USC. On the other hand, for USC, you were sitting at 4-1. Second place, you fall to 4-2. Oregon obviously picks up the win, and suddenly you're in a 3-way tie. Obviously, if the season ended today, you would be the 3 seed. But Oregon and Colorado are both right on your tails, and you're only 1 game ahead of Stanford. So Stanford and Washington, for that matter, although I don't think anyone thinks Washington's all that good, but Stanford is a legitimate program you have to worry about. They can get hot at certain times. So yeah, those were the upsets yesterday. It was a pretty crazy day in college basketball. But we have some games today. By the way, I'm guaranteed to have to do a dare. If you guys just put in the comment section below, I will have to do it. So just write it down in the comment section. The most liked one gets to give me a dare, which is pretty dang and crazy that I didn't get to 4 points this week. Probably because I didn't do 2 videos, but wouldn't have mattered. I was picking the wrong teams to win anyway. It kind of sucked. I'm angry. But even if I get the most upset, the best I can get is 3, and I got to get to 4. So just write in the comment section below that I have to do an upset, and you can, I have to do it. And the most likely one I have to do, I really don't want to do this, but I made a promise to you guys. As long as no one watches this content, I don't have to do it. So, but we have 2 games today. 11 o'clock, we got Butler, which is at 9-6, traveling to number 14, Villanova. Villanova is favored by 15 points on FS1. And 11 o'clock, we got Penn State, which is at 8-6, traveling to number 16, Ohio State, which sits at 10-4, right? So let's talk about the Big East one first. How that affects everything in the Big East. Again, Villanova is first place in the Big East. I know, you're stunned, you're throttled. It's very confusing. I know, you're scared. But this is the normal thing to happen. But on the other hand, a loss. A win for Villanova obviously keeps them first place in the Big East. That's a big thing, right? A loss, on the other hand, would help extramentally for Providence. Providence would then take first place in the Big East. Providence team, in my opinion, is severely underrated this year. Providence, I think, is a very, very good basketball team. 10-0 at home. They have not lost at home. And while Villanova's I haven't lost at home either, they've only played 5 games at home. I mean, it's pretty crazy what is going on in this conference of champions. But again, both these Providence only lost 1 game on the road this year. The only game they lost was on a neutral court. So Providence obviously would love Villanova loss here today by Butler. What would happen with Butler with a win? Butler goes up sky high. Suddenly Butler goes from, if you're looking at it right now, Butler's in 7th place in the Big East. Only teams below them are Seton Hall, St. John's, DePaul, and Georgetown. None of those teams are having good seasons. Seton Hall's somehow in the top 25. That will change this week, trust me. Butler with a loss here, they don't move anywhere, but they lose their tie. Right now they're tied for 5th place with Creighton and UConn. But with a loss, you fall out of tied for 5th place and fall just straight into 7th by yourself. Now, I wouldn't change your seeding if the season ended today, but that game might end up making a big difference moving forward. A win today for Butler, though. A win today does a lot for Butler. A win today for Butler makes them tied for 3rd place in the Big East. That is how crazy close the Big East is this year. A win can move you from 7th place to 3rd, tied for 3rd with Xavier. Now, to be fair, they would be the 4th if that ended up, because tiebreakers would break Xavier's way. But I don't know. I think this is a really interesting matchup between Butler and Villanova. Then you look at the Penn State matchup, and I know I'm a Penn State fan, so this is going to sound hypocritical coming from me at how impressed I am with this Penn State team. But this was a Penn State team that returned 1 starter, really. I mean, if you count Seth Lundy, maybe 2, right? You returned 4 players from last year of the 9 that saw playing time. So you don't even have enough for an offense, really. You return John Harrar, you return Seth Lundy, you return Miles Dredd, and you return Sam Sessoms. So how are you going to make this team? You're going to make it with freshmen? Nah, you're going to go in the transfer portal. And you're going to find one of the best players I've ever seen come from the transfer portal, and that's Jalen Pickett. Jalen Pickett has just been phenomenal. One of the best players in the Big Ten, in my opinion. And you suddenly get him on the same offense as Seth Lundy and John Harrar. If they're all hot, Ohio State's going to have some trouble. They really are. The other players aren't as important. They do stuff. They're definitely there. Greg Lee's starting to catch a little bit of fire, the transfer from Western Michigan. But the other transfers haven't really panned out the way you would want them to. Jaheim Cornwall has done not great this year. Not a great three-point shooter, which is why you brought him in from Gardner-Webb. Miles Dredd has been not great off the bench. Sam Sessoms is averaging over 10 points a game, which, I mean, he was a major reason why they crushed Rutgers. And when Sam's hot, he is hot. He's our best three-point shooter, which is odd because he was one of our worst three-point shooters last year. But Sam Sessoms is a legitimate player off the bench. He's a great help. Jelani White's helpful off the bench. I mean, the Penn State definitely has some pieces. Johnson off the bench, I don't think they use him enough. He's a clean three-point shot, that's for sure. But Penn State, I understand, it doesn't sound impressive. They're tied for 7th place in the Big Ten. But you look at this Big Ten, it's stacked, right? You got Illinois at the top. You have Wisconsin, Michigan State, Ohio State. All these teams are top 25 teams. You have Purdue, their top 10 team. Indiana is a team I think could be in the top 25 heading into the year. And they're tied. Penn State's tied for Indiana with a 3-3 record. So with a win for Ohio State, they move to 5-2. Don't do much. That doesn't do much for Ohio State other than make them about half game behind Michigan State and Wisconsin. But it does get them out of the tie. Right now, they're tied for 4th place with Rutgers. Obviously, if the season ends today, Ohio State would get the nod over Rutgers, which would suck for Rutgers because you have the same record. But just Ohio State has played 2 less games than you, which means they have 2 less losses than you, which kind of sucks, but that's the way the tiebreaker works out. But with a Ohio State win, you would break the tiebreaker. With a loss, Ohio State would fall to 4-3. I don't believe that's worse than 3-2, but you would at least fall below Rutgers, and it's possible Purdue as well. So Ohio State would lose that 4 spot, which is that is the spot. If you want to be in the top 4, because that way you get a double bye. You get 2 days off instead of just 1 day off. You have to beat one less team than other teams, and you don't get beat up from playing the day prior. So, obviously you want the 4 spot. 4 spot is coveted. But with a Penn State win, you move to 4-3, and then suddenly you at least break the tiebreaker with Indiana. I don't know if you pass Purdue. You definitely don't pass Rutgers, which you beat a couple days ago. But Penn State's a team that is starting to look really hot. It's a team that is 8-6, but you look at their losses. You have the 7-point loss to Purdue that was very close near the end of it. You have the 16-point loss to Michigan State, which really hurts, and 12-point loss to Ohio State. Obviously, you want to get that back. But these games, you're looking back on them, the losses out of conference are not bad, right? The loss to Miami looked bad, but suddenly Miami looks like quite possibly the best team in the ACC, and it suddenly doesn't look so bad now, does it? It was only a 5-point loss. 5-point loss to LSU in overtime also doesn't look that bad, knowing how good LSU has turned out to be. And then the loss to UMass at the beginning of the year, obviously one of the worst losses Penn State has. But regardless, this is still a very good Penn State team that is playing its best basketball right now. It's 3-1 over the past few games, and these aren't 3-1s against some chump teams. They have a win over 12-4 Indiana. They have a win over a Northwestern team that just beat Michigan State this weekend, and they have a win over the 5th team in Rutgers. So this is not a chump win. It was chump stretch. They played Purdue close. They legitimately played them. They gave Purdue almost all they could handle. Obviously, they didn't pull it out in the end. They got cold at the end of the game. But Penn State kind of laid out a formula on how to beat Purdue, by the way. If you're a good team watching, it's get their big guys in foul trouble early. Because if you can do that, they have to play small, and then you can dominate them on the inside. That's what Penn State did. And you got to get a player get hot from 3-point range, and that was Pickett in that game. So this is being a long video. With a loss, Penn State would move to 3-4. I don't believe that might be a little bit worse than 2-3. I don't know how that tiebreaker would work out with Iowa. Obviously, Penn State ideally does not lose this game, but I got to go with it. I got to go with my boys. They're the lower underdog, too. They're only 9.5-point underdogs compared to Butler's 15-point underdogs. But everybody, this is GGB saying adios amigos and go Nittany Lions.